Now this mixing hack, I want to talk a little bit about gain inside of Live and setting volume levels and 0 dB full scale and some of that technical stuff. Now I'm going to be honest with you guys, I'm not an audiologist. I don't know all of the tech specs, all of the details that go into all of this stuff, but I know enough to do good mixes and be a good mix engineer. And I'm going to provide you with as much information as I can so you can still be a musician, but also start to do some better mixes as well. Now the first thing I do want to talk about, as I mentioned, is gain. And what gain is basically the audio level at any given point in time. So I've got just a simple project here with 3 elements, a drum loop, a bass loop, and a pad that will play back here. And if I flip over to the session view, you can see that the mixer in the session view is showing me my volume levels. And if we extend the mixer a little bit, now the mixer can be extended by clicking this line area right here, and if you drag up and down you can extend it or shrink it. If you extend it just a little bit, you'll start to see what's called a peak meter shows up on each of your tracks. And this is showing me where that volume level is peaking at. So we can see here that my drums are peaking at about minus 12.4 dB, my bass is peaking at about minus 7 dB, and then this pad is right around minus 8.89 dB. And another thing you'll notice is if you take the fader and you move it, you'll see that the fader level is represented here. And if I bring that up to 0, you can also bring it to 0 just by clicking the fader and pressing delete. It'll snap it right to 0. But you can see that these 2 lines here represent 0 dB. And so anything, or 0 dB full scale I should say, and anything that goes above those lines is, well, technically speaking, it's going to be clipping, meaning that the tops and bottoms of the waveforms where it gets too loud are going to get cropped off. We're going to start to hear some hard digital clipping. Now this is true only if it happens over here on the master track. So let's just look at a quick example of this. Let me bring my drums back to where they were, about minus 12 dB. And you can see now my master output, so all 3 of these elements summed together, we're peaking at about minus 4.2-ish dB. Cool, so let's take the drums and just pull their volume up a bit. And I'm going to pull them up to a point where the output is exceeding or going over that 0 dB full scale mark. So right around here you can see our master out is starting to go into the red here. We're going positive 2 dB over 0, 2.2 dB to be exact. And what we're doing is we're outputting a clipped signal. And this is ugly. If we were to bounce this to an audio file, and if you were to zoom in and look at the waveform, you could see clipping. You could see the tops and bottoms of the waveform cropped off. We're going to add digital distortion to this, which I could get into my opinions about that. I know some people say it's good, some people say it's bad. I'm not here to give you my opinion, I'm just here to tell you what's going on so you can use that knowledge to your benefit. But technically what's happening here is our output is clipping. Now let's jump back over here to the drums track for a minute. And let's reset the volume back to where we were before we were clipping. So we got all our things nicely summed together, and we're here sitting pretty under 0 dB. And this is generally speaking where you want to be when you are mixing your track down. You want to set your levels in such a way so that your peak meter on your master is not going above 0 dB. You want to have what's called headroom. We have that space under 0 dB. Now, a helpful way to keep track of this and see where all of your levels are at are obviously to use these peak meters on the track. But another thing that I think a lot of producers tend to overlook are these little gain staging meters that show up between devices on a track. So if you have 1 or more devices on a track, you're going to see these. So I'm on the drums track right now, and we've got a compressor and then a couple of utility effects. Let's take a look at this compressor. And because all these effects are off, we can see that the gain staging is going to stay even between each device. So the level of the input remains the same as the level of the output through all these devices, again, just because they're all bypassed. But if I turn this compressor on, you can hear the drums got a little bit louder there. We squashed them and then we boosted the makeup gain. You can see my input level is now lower, we can see that visually here, than my output level. So in the process of compressing these drums, I've done something that's added gain, that's added volume to this signal, and it's good to be aware of that. And a tip I can give all of you is whenever you're adding processing, whenever you're adding effects to a signal, keep an eye on those gain stage meters and see, did I add gain? Did I add loudness to the signal? Because loudness, when something is louder than it was before, even if it's just a little bit louder, it tends to sound much better to our ears. And that's often how we deceive ourselves into a really bad mix. So right now, for example, I have this compressor on the drums. The compressor is making my drum sound a little bit louder. Why not throw 20 compressors on there and just max it out, make it sound as loud as possible? Not really a good idea, because we're going to eventually get to a point where we're clipping if we're not careful. So let's do something kind of stupid here. Let me bypass the compressor for a minute. And I threw two utilities on here. Let's just turn one of these on. Now the utility by itself, if it's switched on or switched off, if it's in its default state, it's not doing anything. But the reason I pulled in this effect is because it has a simple gain dial, which is just going to turn up the gain or the level of this drum signal. Now it's also worth noting here, all of these levels that we're seeing, these are all what's happening to this drum signal before it hits the channel fader. Okay, so all of this is happening before the fader. So anyway, let's turn this up, and I'm actually going to turn my computer volume down because we're going to turn this up a stupid amount here. So you can probably hear the digital clipping going crazy out our master. We can see it. Why do it once when we can do it twice? Okay, so what we just did was absolutely stupid there. We've taken the drums and we've boosted them 35 dB plus 35 dB. That's about 70 dB of gain boost we've just added. So you might think right now, my drums are totally destroyed. Unless I turn these utilities off, my drums are totally destroyed, and in fact my whole mix is totally destroyed. Now there's something interesting though that happens inside of Ableton Live in most DAWs nowadays, and that is what's called 32-bit floating point processing. Now I'm not even going to pretend for a minute I know what every statement in that phrase means, but in a nutshell what it means is that all of the dynamic processing, all of the gain that we're adding or taking away is all relative before we hit this 0 dB full scale mark here on the master. Once this signal goes above 0 dB there, it's kind of like all bets are off, and then the output is clipping no matter what. But even if we do something ridiculously stupid like this, like just add a crap load of gain to our drums, if we go over here to the master, we can actually fix it. So let's take a utility, and in fact let's duplicate it. So I'll just Command D or Control D. We'll get 2 copies of it on the master track. So let's play that again, just stupidly loud drums. But here on the master, both of these utilities are going to affect or attenuate, that just means bring the volume down, they're going to attenuate the gain before we hit the master fader here, basically before we go over this 0 dB full scale mark on the master. So let's turn both of these down. And now if I play my mix back again, you can hear how the drums are no longer clipped. Let me actually turn my volume up on the computer so we can hear that all a little bit clearer. And so essentially what's happening here is we've sort of saved the drums. Now, I'm not telling you this because I recommend you go on to every track and you make sure everything's as red as it can possibly be. There's a meme I'm going to bring up on screen right now, which is a hilarious way to sort of emphasize this fact. But I'm not telling you this to boost the crap out of all of your gains, but I'm just telling you this because all of the gain, all of the leveling you do inside your DAW is relative before you hit that 0 dB full scale mark on the output. So it's very important that this is never going over 0 here. But if you've got a couple of tracks that are going over 0 by a little bit, or in this case even a lot bit, they can always be fixed. You can always pull levels down before you get to the master output. Okay, now what I would, obviously my best suggestion for you would be to, let's just get rid of all these utilities. Let's go to the drums, make sure we get rid of these two. Just keep it under control before it goes out that master output. Or actually before it even goes out the channel output for that track. Okay, so you've got something like 60 or 7 dB of sort of artificial gain built into every track just because of this 32-bit floating point dynamic processing that's going into your DAW. Other DAWs do this too, Logic, Pro Tools, Cubase, a lot of these guys do the same thing in terms of the internal processing. But all of them are going to behave the same way, as far as I know. When we go over the 0 dB full scale mark on the master out, we're getting a clipped signal going out to the outside world. And a lot of this, of course, is going to be based on your digital to analog converters, your audio interface that you're using. But you will be getting a clipped signal out of your DAW if it is going over 0 on the master. But before that point, anything we do is fixable. So if, for example, we go back to the drums and we turn this compressor on, and I've added a little bit of gain to it, I can fix that by either turning the output gain down, or another thing we can do is just grab that utility again, maybe just pull the gain down a little bit here. And my goal again is to get the effect of the compressor, but I want to see the input level about even to what my output level is. And in terms of mix processing, this is going to help you because you're going to hear more of the effect of what the compressor in this case is doing to the signal, as opposed to just hearing the compressor make everything louder and deceiving yourself into thinking, oh, well, that sounds a lot better, let's just leave that. It's always good to kind of gain match things before and after you put a processor, whether it's a compressor, an EQ, distortion, whatever it is, on a sound. Gain match it, make sure the gain in is about the same as the gain out. It doesn't have to be exact, but you want to get it pretty close. And then just take a good quality listen to how is that affecting the signal? Do I like it? Is it boosting the gain? Is it attenuating the gain? Or is it just making things seem louder? Which a lot of times if you're trying to get more perceived loudness out of your mix is the goal. You want things to seem louder, but not actually be peaking louder out the output. So, I could go on for probably another hour about this stuff, but I just wanted to give you a little bit of insight as to how gain is going to work internally inside of Ableton Live, and to pay attention to your gain stage meters, and lastly, to make sure that your master output is never clipping. My word of advice would be try and keep this peak meter hitting happily somewhere around the -6 dB mark. I think that's always a good safe place to be. And a little trick I like to use before we wrap up here is I like to put a utility directly on my master and just turn it down by a few dB. Maybe we'll turn it down to -2, -3. And if I click the gain stage meter, or I'm sorry, the peak meter to reset it, you can see now we're at about -7 dB of peak. Perfect. I got plenty of headroom so that if I were to bounce out this mix and give it to a mastering engineer, they would have headroom to play around with. You don't want to bounce out a mix, give it to a mastering engineer with no headroom, right at 0 dB or just below 0 dB. They're going to want to hit you in the face because you're going to give them no headroom to play around with to bump things up or bring things out in your mix. It's always good to keep headroom. And one final bit of advice I'll give you is don't worry too much about is your master output as loud as it possibly can be. I know a lot of people mix their tracks nowadays with reference tracks, and you want to try and get it commercially or competitively loud. Getting it competitively loud is not about getting the volume peak meter on the master as close to 0 dB as possible. It's about getting a good clean mix with relative volume levels that sound good against each other and plenty of headroom on your master. When you bounce that mix out and you either get it mastered or you master it yourself, that's where the commercial loudness is going to come out. So when you're actually working on your music, don't worry too much about that yet. You just want to worry more about getting a good clean mix, getting your volume balance nice between all your different elements, and then having your master output peaking somewhere around that -6 dB mark. I promise you're going to be in a good place. So again, I hope that's given you some insight on how gain is working internally inside Live, and you can start to make better decisions as to setting your levels and making sure your master out doesn't go above 0. And happy mixing. I will catch you guys in the next one. Take care.